introduction. It's really an honor to be here with you all this evening. I'm going to speak for about an hour, and I hope to have some time after that to answer any questions you might have about my presentation and this project. But I'll go ahead and knock out the first question that people tend to ask me, which is, how does a person who is not Jewish and who can't play a lick of violin, how does this person come to write a book about these violins with connections to the Holocaust? And the answer to that question is that the university where I teach, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, had the honor and privilege of bringing 18 of the Violins of Hope to our city in 2012. I'm going to share my screen so you can see a little bit of this. There we see a student experiencing the exhibit here in Charlotte a little over 10 years ago now. This was the first time that the instruments had been anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And in the years leading up to that residency, I became increasingly fascinated by the project. So in 2011, I took a trip to Tel Aviv, my first trip to Israel, to meet with Amnon Weinstein, the Israeli violin maker who started the Violins of Hope project. I heard his stories and held the violins in my hands. It was during that trip that I decided to write a book about the Violins of Hope. And I decided early on that the book would center around Amnon as the patriarch of this project, because his personal story is deeply intertwined with his mission to restore the violins. Amnon's earliest memories are of his immediate family sitting around the family table in Tel Aviv at major Jewish holidays like Rosh Hashanah and Passover in the late 1940s. There were 4 of them at the table: Amnon, his little sister Esther, and their parents Moshe and Golda. But always with them, as Amnon remembers it, were 400 ghosts. These were the ghosts of the relatives who had been left behind when Moshe and Golda had immigrated to Palestine in 1938. Moshe was a violinist and violin teacher. Knowing that he would not be able to make a living as a violinist in Palestine, Moshe decided to become a violin repairman. The violin, excuse me, is a very popular instrument in Jewish culture, and Moshe wisely predicted that the tens of thousands of Jews who were immigrating to Palestine would create a market for an outstanding craftsman who could fix their instruments. In order to develop his skills, Moshe traveled to Warsaw to apprentice with Yaakov Zimmerman, a respected Jewish violin maker. Zimmerman is remembered as an outstanding artisan who was also very kind, especially toward young Jewish musicians. Famous violinist Ida Handel, some of you may have known her from the Miami music scene, who was 7 years old when her father brought her to Warsaw to study at the Chopin Conservatory, described Zimmerman as a selfless person who would often repair instruments for free. Former concertmaster of the Berlin Philharmonic Michel Schwalbe, who also trained in Warsaw, recalled how Zimmerman gave him everything he needed to play the violin, including instruments, strings, and bow hairs. Zimmerman even found a room in the apartment of Warsaw industrialist Szymon Krongold, in which Schwalbe could practice. For Jewish children like Handel and Schwalbe, this level of support was life-changing. Zimmerman disappeared during the Holocaust. It is assumed that he died in the Warsaw Ghetto. Upon moving from Vilna, Lithuania to Palestine, Moshe opened his violin shop and quickly established himself as a prominent figure in Tel Aviv's burgeoning music scene. He was a peaceful man who thought that all children should learn to play the violin. People who played music, he believed, could be neither evil nor violent. While the exploitation of music during the Holocaust would prove him wrong, Moshe himself exemplified the noble principles behind his convictions by arranging scholarships that helped promising young talents like Pinchas Zuckerman and Shlomo Mintz travel to the United States to study at the Juilliard School. Moshe and Golda also started a family. Their son Amnon was born in 1939. Their daughter Esther came along 5 years later. By the end of the Holocaust, Moshe and Golda had heard very little from the relatives they had left behind. At first, they had received a few letters asking for help with securing visas from family members who had hoped to join them in Palestine. But all communication had stopped once Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. They heard nothing from their family. They heard nothing of their family. After the Holocaust, a survivor visited the Weinsteins in Tel Aviv and told them that their entire family, 400 people in all, had been murdered during the Holocaust. Before the war, Moshe's family had moved to Volkovisk, which was occupied by the Nazis shortly after the German invasion. The Germans had started massacring Jews immediately. On November 2nd, 1942, all of the remaining Jews from Volkovisk and the surrounding areas were marched toward a former prisoner of war camp. A number of Jews who tried to escape were caught and executed. One of them was Moshe's brother, who was shot on the spot. By the end of the year, all but 2,000 of the 20,000 Jews in the camp would be sent to the Treblinka death camp. Everyone else was sent to Auschwitz on January 12, 1943. The horrific stories were too much for Moshe to handle. He survived the heart attack that he had that night, but he never spoke of his family again. It was simply too painful. It was just as hard for Golda to talk about her family. They had remained behind in Vilna, which was occupied by the German army on June 24th, 1941. The troops were quickly followed by the death squads that began rounding up Jews and taking them to the nearby Ponari forest. Ponari had once been a popular weekend getaway for Vilna's Jews and Gentiles alike. Now it would become the site of one of the most brutal massacres in the Holocaust. There were 57,000 Jews living in Vilna during the German invasion. By the time the Red Army liberated the city on July 13th, 1944, only a few thousand remained. Like Moshe, none of Golda's relatives survived. Racked with survivor's guilt, Golda threw away the letters she had received from her family. The memories were like voices she could no longer bear to hear. When young Amnon would ask about his grandparents, aunts, and uncles, she would struggle to find words to explain why he would never be able to meet them. All she could do was to bring out a book she had found about the Vilna Ghetto and the Ponari massacre. "This is where your grandparents are," she would tell young Amnon, pointing to the ghastly photos of the dead. "Here is your family." She would break down in tears, unable to explain further. Although they could never bring themselves to discuss their dead relatives, the guilt and sorrow Moshe and Golda felt over their devastating losses permeated the Weinstein household, and with it, Amnon's childhood. There were tangible reminders as well. The Weinstein apartment was the first stop in Palestine for survivors from Vilna who were hoping to start a new life in the land of their biblical ancestors. Moshe and Golda welcomed them all into their apartment for homemade meals and warm beds until they could find homes of their own. Young Amnon was frightened by the emaciated guests who were startled by every noise. He could not understand while they hid leftover bread under their pillows and blankets. Years passed until the sounds of the visitors crying themselves to sleep stopped resonating in his own nightmares. As a young man, Amnon tried to forget about the catastrophe that had robbed him of his extended family and replaced them with these terrifying strangers. He busied himself with establishing a career as a luthier, a maker and repairer of string instruments. Growing up in his father's violin shop, Amnon had watched as Moshe had helped countless young violinists launch their performing careers. Moshe had given the poorest students violins, bows, and strings, just as his mentor, Yaakov Zimmerman, had done for Jewish children in Warsaw. Amnon wanted to make the same impact on the lives of musicians. When Moshe passed away in 1986, Amnon took over the family business. In 1998, he continued the dynasty that his father had initiated by starting to train his own son, Avshalom, who may be the first third-generation Jewish luthier in history. By that time, Amnon had established himself as one of the finest luthiers in the world and an important figure in Israeli culture. Despite Amnon's efforts to ignore the Holocaust, it continued to haunt him. In the late 1980s, a man who had played the violin in Auschwitz visited Amnon's workshop. The survivor had not touched his instrument since leaving the death camp. He now wanted to get it restored for his grandson. The top of the violin was damaged from having been played outside in the rain and the snow. When Amnon took the instrument apart, he discovered inside ashes. Ashes that he could only assume to be fallout from the crematoria at Auschwitz. The very thought of what that violin and its owner had been through together shook Amnon to his very core. But he quickly pushed those gruesome thoughts aside. It was still too difficult for him to think about the Holocaust. By the 1990s, around the same time he started training his son Avshi, Amnon was finally ready to reclaim his lost heritage. 5 decades after his family had been destroyed, he started reflecting not only on the Holocaust, but on the role that music, specifically the violin, played in Jewish lives throughout that dark period. Amnon began locating and restoring violins that were played by Jewish musicians during the Holocaust. Some of the instruments that Amnon has tracked down were damaged during the Holocaust and had been unplayable ever since. But once he brings the instruments into his workshop, Amnon pours his heart, his soul, and his considerable expertise as a master luthier into breathing new life into them. The painstaking restorations can take up to 18 months. When Amnon is done piecing the violins back together, they're ready for performances in the world's finest concert halls. Although some of the musicians who once played the neglected and severely damaged instruments were silenced by the Holocaust, their voices and spirits live on through the violins that Amnon has lovingly restored. These are the instruments that he calls the violins of hope. I would like to show you a brief clip about Amnon so you can see him and his workshop for yourself and hear him tell a little bit of his story.
After the war, when all the atrocities that happened in Germany, in Poland, in other places arrived to Israel, this is the most difficult time of my life. When I asked my mother, where is my grandfather, where is my grandmother, where is my aunts, where all the family, she used to take a book of Vilna to show me the Ponar forest where they kill all the Jewish people, 80,000 people, and say, here is your family. My father, when he learned what happened to his family, how he lost about 400 people, he never spoke again about the Holocaust. Never. When the war ended, my father was the head of the Vilna Association in Israel. So many of the new immigrants who survived and escaped came to our house for the first day in Israel. Nobody want to play on a German instrument. Nobody want to touch it anymore. So they came to my father and said to him, if you are not buying this violin, I'm breaking it or burn it. And for my father, this was sacrilege. And he bought every instrument that people bring it to him. And he knew 100% he can never sell it again. He could not fix it, but he could not throw it away.
Amnon's spirit is expressed in the way he works. He brings the violins more to life than they were originally made for. He calls me sometimes and says, listen, there are those two sisters who came here, old ladies, who buried their violin in Holland underground and took it out after the war. And they brought me that violin. I'm going to bring it back to life.
The Holocaust is a story of death, but the Holocaust is also a story of hope, because many people survive. And the music was a part of it.
Each violin in the collection tells its own story. In my book, Violins of Hope, I have the honor of chronicling the stories of 6 of those violins and what they and their owners went through together during the Holocaust. Each story is inspiring in its own way, but perhaps no story is more dramatic than that of young Motele Schlein. Motele was only 12 years old when the Nazis came into his tiny village in Ukraine and murdered his parents and his little sister. Motele escaped to the forest with his most cherished possession, his violin. Motele lived on his own in the forest for several months until he ultimately met up with and joined the legendary partisan brigade known as Uncle Misha's Jewish Group. As a member of Uncle Misha's Jewish Group, Motele established himself as a clever and daring young man with a real knack for espionage. In August of 1943, Motele infiltrated a Nazi soldiers club in the Ukrainian town of Ovruch. The soldiers club was one of many restaurants that the Germans had appropriated as havens for soldiers on their way to the perilous Eastern Front. It was a place where they could strengthen their resolve with great music, gourmet food, French wine, and pretty Ukrainian waitresses who served them in more ways than one. Posing as an ethnic Ukrainian, Motele secured a job playing his violin as entertainment for the guests of the Soldiers Club. He laughed at their jokes and took their requests, earning their trust and admiration. A regional commandant who spent every evening at the Soldiers Club went so far as to have a little German uniform and cap tailored for their young violinist. While playing his violin, Motele was able to track the numbers of units and the types of uniforms worn by German soldiers on their way to the front. He also eavesdropped on the conversations of the few who returned. Between lunch and dinner, he surveilled the streets of Ovruch, taking note of everything for his reports back to the partisans. In return for his services to the Soldiers Club, Motele received a few Reichsmarks a day, as well as free lunch and free dinner in the Soldiers Club's basement kitchen. He usually ate his lunches before playing in the afternoon and returned downstairs for his dinner after he was done every night. One day, on his way back upstairs after lunch, Motele noticed that one of the storerooms across the dimly lit hallway from the kitchen had been left open. He peered into the darkness and discovered a large cellar filled with empty wine cases, herring barrels, and other discarded items that had clearly been forgotten. On the wall opposite the doorway was a jagged crack, presumably the result of a nearby bomb explosion. Motula, who had heard numerous tales of sabotage from other members of Uncle Misha's Jewish group, stopped in his tracks. He realized that if he filled that crack with explosives, he could blow up the Soldiers Club and kill all of the Germans inside. One evening, after finishing his dinner and saying goodnight to the cook, Motula crept into the storeroom. He hid his instrument inside an empty barrel and left the Soldier Club with an empty violin case. When he returned the next day, his case had a few pounds of explosives hidden inside. After his lunch, he snuck into the storeroom and swapped the explosives for his violin. Motula repeated this process over the next several days until he had successfully hidden all 40 pounds of explosives in the cellar. Whenever he could, Motula would return to the storeroom to break off the stones that surrounded the crack in the wall and replace them with the deadly material. When he had packed all of the explosives into the wall, he inserted the capsule detonator and the long wick that the partisans had given him. He hid everything behind a pile of garbage. At the same time, Motula was working on an escape plan. Every day, he would visit the river that borders Ovruch, pretending to be fishing or swimming while actually looking for an area that would be shallow enough for him to cross during his getaway. On his way to and from the lake, he would note the streets and gardens through which he would have to run on his flight out of town. The only aspect of the plan that remained unresolved was when. When to detonate the bomb. The perfect opportunity finally presented itself when a division of the SS came through Ovruch on their way to try to salvage the increasingly hopeless situation for the Germans on the Eastern Front. At around 3 p.m, their cars and motorcycles began to arrive at the Soldiers Club. The restaurant quickly filled with high-ranking SS officers in their formal attire. Motula's violin could barely be heard above the din of clanking dishes, clinking glasses, and loud laughter. Motula was forbidden from taking any breaks as the guests got drunker and the cigar smoke thickened. Motula's fingers started to ache from the nonstop playing. His eyes burned as the cigar smoke filled the room, but he continued to play. It was not until 11 that night that Motula was finally allowed to leave. He went downstairs to the kitchen and told the cook that he was too tired to eat his dinner after playing the violin for 8 hours straight. He left the kitchen and entered the hallway. Groping around in the darkness, Motula found the storeroom door and quietly closed it behind him. Using the dim light from a small grated window as a guide, he located the detonator and ignited it. He hastily ran out of the cellar, down the hallway, and up the stairs. Slowing as he approached the soldier who guarded the exit, he extended his right arm and proclaimed a sarcastic Heil Hitler. The guard, familiar with the affable young violinist, whom he assumed to be a young Ukrainian boy, in his little soldier's uniform, amusedly responded, "Ah, you little Ukrainian swine," and Motula vanished into darkness. After running for a few hundred feet, Motula heard a violent explosion behind him. The ground shook and window panes shattered. He heard police whistles and sirens and saw red flares illuminate the sky over Ovruch. Terrified and euphoric at the same time, Motula hid himself from view by flattening his body against the buildings as he escaped. He ran into the river, holding his violin above his head with both hands to protect it from the cold water that reached up to his neck. Glancing backward, he saw an enormous fireball shooting into the sky. When Motula reached the other side of the lake, 5 armed partisans from Uncle Misha's Jewish group plucked him out of the water and into their wagon. They quickly disappeared back into the safety of the woods. For a few minutes, Mottola was speechless, overwhelmed by the success of his mission. Then, raising his clenched fists to the red sky, he declared in a trembling voice, "That is for my parents and my little sister." One question that people often ask me is how the Weinsteins find these violins. In the case of Mottola's violin, the instrument was brought to Amnon by Uncle Misha's grandson, who had inherited the violin and who happened to know that Amnon was a violin maker. Other instruments find their way to the Weinsteins in less direct ways. In October 1941, Feivel Vinegar was taken with his family on a death march. As they marched through the snow, many prisoners died from starvation, exposure, exhaustion, and brutality at the hands of their Nazi guards. Feivel watched in horror as his uncle and mother passed away along this death march through Romania. The Romanian Jews were marched across a river they called the Nistru to Transnistria, a territory that Romania had recently annexed from the Soviet Union. The Nazi Romanian government had designated Transnistria as the ethnic dumping ground for their entire Jewish population. The Jews would be marched into Transnistria and either subjected to more mass killings or simply left to die with no food, nor water, nor means to support themselves. By 1943, at least 105,000 of the Romanian Jews who were expelled to Transnistria would be dead, along with 115 to 180,000 Jews who had already been living there. In Transnistria, Feivel and his remaining family members ended up in the ghetto of Shargorod. The Shargorod ghetto was packed with 7,000 deportees who were squeezed into 337 buildings, homes, cellars, and attics. Feivel was able to rent a single room from a local peasant that became home to his family and another family, 17 people in all. Feivel found a job cutting down trees, for which he was paid a quarter of a loaf of stale and moldy bread daily. This was not nearly enough to feed his family. Feivel gave the bread he earned to his father, his wife, and their 6-month-old daughter, Helen. He sustained himself by eating snow and leftovers that he foraged from the garbage. 10 days after Feivel arrived in Shargorod, a man paid him a visit. Feivel barely recognized him as a judge from his hometown in Romania. Feivel remembered him as a tall, elegantly dressed man of distinction in both the Jewish and Gentile communities. But the man standing before him was stooped, emaciated, and wearing a dirty, shabby suit. He approached Feivel, extending a trembling hand that was dried and blistered. In his other hand, he carried a violin case. "Please be seated, Your Honor," Feivel greeted him. The judge sheepishly smiled a toothless grin and sat down. "I live nearby with my 2 sisters," the judge explained. "I am too weak and too old for the jobs here. We have no food, no firewood." "I know that you're a musician," he said. "I also played once when my hands still worked. You are young, and you will be able to play for many years." The judge opened the case and took out an amati, an instrument crafted by one of the most respected names in violin making. It was Niccolo Amati who had taught Andrea Guarneri, the patriarch of the Guarneri dynasty, and who may have been Antonio Stradivari's teacher. Feivel's hands shook as the judge handed him the expensive instrument. "Take it," the judge insisted. "What good is the violin if I have no food? If you're able to earn a little something from making music, then don't forget me." It was not until the next day that Feivel summoned the courage to open the case. He nervously removed the instrument, placed it against his neck, and drew the bow lightly across the strings. He was instantly enchanted by the sound. He had never heard such a beautiful instrument. He closed his eyes and started playing. The music transported him to a different place, to a different time. He was no longer in the ghetto. He was not hungry. He was not soaking wet. And he was not wearing shabby rags. He was the richest man in the world. When Fievel stopped playing, he opened his eyes. Everyone in the room was staring at him in amazement. Several fellow deportees from the street had entered the room to hear him play. People who were hungry, sick, and infested with lice simply stood there with smiles on their faces. They too had been carried away by his violin playing. Fievel's Ukrainian landlord appeared and shooed away all the strangers. "You really do play nicely," he said. "Do you know how to play Ukrainian music? I could recommend you to play at a wedding." 2 days later, the landlord brought Fievel to a wedding in a nearby village. The wedding was a traditional Ukrainian celebration that lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Fievel played nonstop. He'd never heard the Ukrainian folk songs that the partygoers requested, but he had a good ear. You might remember the old joke, hum a few bars and maybe I could fake it. Fievel was apparently very good at faking it and learning these tunes very quickly as they were sung to him. In exchange for delighting the wedding guests, Fievel received a 5-pound loaf of bread to take home. When Fievel returned to Shagarat, he immediately went to see the judge to give him a quarter of the loaf. He was determined to honor the judge's wishes that he share everything he made playing the Amati. Fievel arrived at the judge's house only to learn that the judge and his 2 sisters had been taken to the cemetery the day before. They had poisoned themselves. They simply could not bear another day of starving and freezing in the ghetto. Fievel brought the violin to his chin and accompanied himself while singing El Malai Rachamim, the traditional Jewish prayer of remembrance. Fievel quickly became popular among Romanian officers and Ukrainian peasants looking for entertainment. He was happy to play in exchange for food that they could bring home to his family. When the Amati was confiscated in the ghetto, a Ukrainian farmer who wanted Fievel to play at his daughter's wedding helped him to acquire a cheap instrument that was nevertheless playable. Fievel played that violin for the next 3 years, earning enough food, water, and precious firewood to sustain himself and the 16 family members and friends with whom he shared a room throughout the remainder of the Holocaust. His ability to make music saved his life and that of his family and friends. After the Holocaust, Fievel immigrated to Israel, bringing with him and his family and the instrument, which he simply called Friend. He took Friend everywhere and played him every Saturday. As his daughter Helen was growing up, he would take out the violin and play it for her regularly. He would tell her the story about how this friend had saved his life and her mother's life. As Fievel aged, he developed arthritis that made it difficult for him to play Friend. After a few years of not even touching the violin, he told Helen, "I want to play again." He was approaching the age of 90, and he and Helen agreed that having Friend restored so he could play them would be a perfect 90th birthday present. "What can I do?" she asked. "Please, repair my violin." Helen is not a musician. She didn't know anything about how to get a violin repaired. But if you ask around in Israel, there's only one name that keeps coming back, and that's the Weinstein Workshop. So she took the instrument to Amnon. "Can you please repair this violin?" she asked, but she did not tell him about the instrument's astonishing history. Amnon was typically busy. "Leave it here, I'll look at it, and I'll give you a call later this evening." A little while later, Amnon telephoned Helen to tell her that the instrument was in serious disrepair. It was never a very good instrument, and it had been so long since it had been maintained that to make the restorations it needed would be prohibitively expensive. In fact, it would be more expensive than the violin was even worth. "Why don't you simply buy a new violin?" Amnon suggested. "That would be much cheaper." Helen went back to Fievel and said, "We have a new plan. For your 90th birthday, I'm going to buy you a new violin." And Fievel just started to cry. "The violin is something that I cannot let go," he said tearfully. "Please, This instrument, this violin, it's my best friend. Helen returned to Amnon and finally told him about the role the instrument had played during the Holocaust. This changed everything. Amnon agreed to bring the instrument back to life for free. I never had the opportunity to meet Fievel. He passed away before I started researching the Violins of Hope. But Helen had the foresight to bring her camera with her when she reunited Fievel with his friend on his 90th birthday. And I don't think I ever fully understood the expression beaming from ear to ear until I saw this picture of Fievel being reunited with his friend. He was clearly delighted. He tried to play the instrument, but his advanced arthritis made it very difficult. This did not matter. Fievel was elated to just once again be able to hold his friend in his arms. He cherished the instrument to his last day, hugging it as his eyes welled with tears of gratitude for this friend that had saved his family. After Fievel passed away, Helen donated Friend to the Violins of Hope project. It now travels all over the world with the rest of the collection. As I travel and now Zoom all over the country talking about the various roles that music played in Jewish lives during the Holocaust, people are sometimes shocked to learn that there were orchestras in many of the camps. It seems inconceivable that an ensemble that we associated with such great beauty would be in places of such great despair. The large camp complex that we collectively refer to as Auschwitz was home to a number of ensembles, including a large orchestra in the Auschwitz main camp, orchestras in the men's and women's camp of Birkenau, and several other ensembles throughout the Auschwitz complex. These orchestras were composed of musicians who were recruited from the prisoner population. The orchestra's main responsibilities were to play marches at the camp gates, to provide a cheerful facade and rhythmic orderliness as the work details marched out of camp and returned every day. Day in and day out, the schmaltzy music the musicians were forced to play formed a macabre counterpoint to the daily deaths in Auschwitz. The ensembles also performed during executions, roll calls, and official visits by luminaries ranging from SS Commander Heinrich Himmler to a delegation of the Red Cross. The orchestras would sometimes play as the trains came to a stop at Auschwitz. Survivors recall the doors being thrown open of their cattle cars. The first sights were of a beautifully manicured lawn. The first sounds they heard were of an orchestra. The music placated the prisoners as they lined up for the selections that would decide who would be immediately sent to the gas chambers and who would be allowed to live a little longer. The music lied to them about what the true nature of what would prove to be the final destination for over 1 million prisoners. The top 80 musicians from the Auschwitz main camp orchestra also played in a symphony orchestra that gave concerts on Sunday afternoons and holidays for the SS officers and guards, as well as for their fellow prisoners. For Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss, the performances provided regular opportunities to present himself to his visitors and family as a cultured patron of the arts. For Höss's subordinates, the concerts lent a sense of normalcy, decency, and even nobility to working in the camp. For the members of the orchestra, the events offered opportunities to earn food and cigarettes from their captors. And for the detainees who attended the symphony orchestra performances, the music provided a mental escape from the harsh realities of life in Auschwitz. As one of the prisoners would say, the Germans put barbed wire all over the camp so no one will escape. But I just close my eyes and I'm on the other side of the wires when I hear the orchestra. They have no idea that we're all fugitives. As a reward for their contributions to camp life, the orchestral musicians sometimes received preferential treatment. This would include special uniforms and lighter work details, such as copying music and repairing musical instruments. Some of the prisoners were assigned to work in the kitchen, giving them access to extra food, while also allowing them to work inside. But membership in the orchestra did not, by any means, spare the musicians from reassignment, deportation, or death. One violinist was selected for execution during a rehearsal. He was allowed to finish the piece before being taken away and killed. A total of 800 musicians performed during the Auschwitz main camp orchestra's 4-year existence, even though the ensemble never included more than 120 musicians at any given time. As one might expect, the legacies of the Auschwitz orchestras are complicated. Some survivors have asserted that the sounds of the orchestra inspired them to stay alive, as they dragged their exhausted bodies back into camp after long days of torturous forced labor. The marches played by their fellow prisoners gave them a little pep in their step, allowing them to appear stronger than they really were. In Auschwitz, those who were too weak to work were no longer useful to camp and were sent to their deaths. But many prisoners resented the orchestras. Primo Levi, a survivor of Auschwitz, wrote of similar reactions he experienced while convalescing in the Auschwitz III infirmary. He wrote about hearing the bass drum and cymbals wafting through the air as the wind changed. The sick prisoners looked at each other from their beds. "We all feel that this music is infernal," he wrote, knowing that the sounds of the schmaltzy German marches would be the last memory of Auschwitz that he would ever be able to forget. For the musicians who played in the orchestras, the small privileges they received offered opportunities to live a little longer, if only for one more day. While participation in an orchestra did not guarantee survival, it did protect musicians from the harshest of labor assignments and sometimes offered warmer uniforms and slightly better food. In many cases, these advantages offered them just enough benefits to outlive the Nazi regime. "Music has kept me alive," violinist Henry Meyer later confirmed. "There is no doubt about it." After their liberation, some of those who survived by playing in orchestras at Auschwitz went on to have distinguished musical careers, Henry Meyer among them. But many of the musicians never played again. Survivors' guilt, combined with deep regret over having been forced to exploit their art to save their lives, rendered making music too painful. One survivor of the Birkenau Men's Camp Orchestra sold his instrument to Abraham Davidovich. Abraham passed it on to his sons, who eventually brought the instrument to the Weinsteins to be added to the Violins of Hope project. As one of the Davidovich brothers told me proudly, "It will go on playing after me, and I hope for many generations." On this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, when we commemorate the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I think it's only fitting to show you a clip from a French documentary of Amnon, in which he visits Auschwitz with his lifelong friend, the Israeli virtuoso violinist Shlomo Metz. In this clip, you will watch as Amnon and Shlomo examine a violin in the Auschwitz Museum. They visited the site where an orchestra once played. Shlomo takes out one of the Violins of Hope. You will see a Star of David inlaid on the back of the violin, and begins to play. The music is the Nigun movement from Jewish composer Ernest Bloch's 3 Pictures of Hasidic Life, a Jewish piece by a Jewish composer, played by a Jewish violinist on a violin with a 6-sided star. In essence, Shlomo is reclaiming music in the name of his people. While Shlomo plays, Amnon visits one of the crematoria at Auschwitz, where he tearfully recites the Kaddish.
Aujourd'hui, c'est le silence, le bruit de la pluie et des vents. Je ne peux pas m'empêcher d'attendre le bruit des camps de concentration, les cris, les pleurs, les chiens et cette musique que les nazis faisaient jouer aux déportés. J'en veux aux nazis de ça qu'ils ont fait à mon peuple. Je veux aux nazis de ça qu'ils ont fait à la musique. Ils l'ont fait pour les complices. La musique, elle leur servait à compter les prisonniers en leur faisant marcher en cadence. Elle leur servait à empêcher les Juifs de se révolter. Les Juifs font confiance au violon. C'est les voix de leur âme. Quand ils attendaient les violons à Auschwitz, ils ne pouvaient plus croire qu'on allait les tuer. Les violons de Auschwitz-Birkenau, de Majdanek, de Sobibor, de Treblinka les ont trompés. Pour effacer ça, il fallait que j'attende Shlomo Mintz jouer notre musique sur un des violons que j'ai restauré. Il me fallait la force de la musique de Shlomo Mintz, que j'ai trouvé la force de venir à Auschwitz.
So this we've seen before.
Yes, I have in my
Roses,
collection.
right.
This is
Typical
typical
roses.
German until the war. Not in good shape, but not in a very bad shape to be
Right.
played like this. Non-maintenance, because this is
So
directly-
what do you think? What do you think of those?
This is a peg that I've had, in the street.
They had different pegs,
Different pegs. Nothing to do
because
with
they
it
don't
together.
belong to those, right?
No, nothing. This is, let's say, before 1900, this one. This one, somebody was cutting for him with a jigsaw.
There's a number here.
I don't think it's a number.
IS.
That's what I think, IS or JS. You know how much time was this guy in the camp?
The man was approximately 2 years.
Because this is before the war. That's dirty. Because you know why? I'm putting on floor.
Yes, of course.
It was played outside. Because the dirt, these are dirty that only if you are playing outside you can see it inside. Please, you have to take care for that.
So this is the place where the musicians were playing. There was an orchestra here, and they've been playing every day, playing for the people who have been working here day in and day out.
This is the violins.
Okay.
This is trumpet. No, this is clarinet.
No, this is trumpet. This
I
is
think
trumpet.
it's clarinet.
No.
No, it's trumpet. These are prisoners. All.
Yeah. Amazing. I'm standing here being extremely cold. This orchestra has been playing here in this weather every day. That is truly incredible, truly admirable, with their hope of surviving yet another day. Just like my teacher, who's been playing in one of those camps. They have been suffering through tormentation of playing music and being killed at the same time.
Nous sommes dans le lieu que là c'était la sélection, on dit, la sélection des Juifs. Droite et gauche, droite à gauche, droite à gauche. Là c'était les vieux, les femmes, les gosses qu'on était allés tout de suite aux chambres de gaz et les restes qu'on était allés pour le travail. Et les violons c'était une partie de ça. Je vais avoir la possibilité de comprendre une violoniste ici qui voit sa famille, qui marche aux chambres de gaz et continue à jouer. Et c'est pour ça que toutes les violonistes, presque, on avait jeté les violons après la guerre.
Le violon qui est avec nous ici à Auschwitz, un violon avec 5 étoiles de David qu'on avait joué dans les camps
Et cet violon-là, il était détruit complètement. C'était une année et demie qu'on l'avait restauré. Et après ça, quand Shlomo il joue avec ça ici, il n'y a rien à faire plus fort que ça pour nous. Parce que ça, c'est comme une prière. Tout ce violon-là, c'est la seule témoignage, sonorité des légendes qu'on était trouvés ici. יתגדל ויתקדש מרבה, בעלמה דברק רעותה, וימליך מלכותה, ויצמח פורקנה, ויקרב משיחה. על ישראל ועל רבנן ועל תלמידיהון ועל כל תלמידיהון ועל כל מאן דעסקין באורייתא, די באתרא קדישא, הדין ודי בכל אתר ואתר, יהא להון ולכון, שלמה רבה, חינה וחסדה, ורחמים וחיים אריכין, ומזוני רווחי ופורקנה, מן קדם אבהון דשמיא ורעה, ואמרו אמן. יש שלמה רבה מן שמיא וחיים טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
The last instrument I write about in Violins of Hope once belonged to Szymon Krongold, an amateur violinist whose accomplished daughter had played with the Warsaw Philharmonic. Szymon's brother Chaim immigrated to Palestine in 1923, never to see Szymon again. Chaim married and raised two children who knew little about their uncle Szymon behind what they could glean from an old picture of him holding his beloved violin. Chaim heard that Szymon escaped from Warsaw to Russia and then to Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Later, he learned that Szymon had died of typhus in Tashkent. In 1946, a man visited Chaim's apartment in Jerusalem to bring him Szymon's violin. The violin stayed with the Krongold family in Jerusalem as one of their only remembrances of Szymon. Chaim's son Nadir later traveled to Tashkent to try to find his uncle's grave. But even the Jewish community there was unable to uncover any information about him. All that is left of Szymon is the photograph of him with the violin and the instrument itself. This is the only memory that we have from him, Nadir explained to me. The only memory and the only story about his life. In September of 1999, Amnon gave an interview on the radio in Israel about Motula Schlein's violin. He asked listeners to contact him if they knew of any other instruments that were connected to the Holocaust. Nadir and his sister Edna responded by bringing him their uncle's violin. After comparing the photograph of Szymon with the instrument, Amnon was finally able to verify that this was indeed Szymon Krongold's violin. The biggest surprise came when Amnon peered into one of the violin's F-shaped sound holes. Attached to the inside of the instrument is a label that reads in Yiddish, "This violin I made for my loyal friend Szymon Krongold, Warsaw, 1924. The dedication is signed by Yakov Zimmerman. Amnon was holding in his hands an instrument that was made by the very same man who had taught his father how to repair violins more than 60 years earlier. The circle was complete. Amnon has never known the names of any of his uncles, aunts, and cousins who died in the Holocaust. Since they were buried in mass graves, there are no graveyards to help him piece together his genealogy. There are no family records nor surviving relatives whom he can visit to learn the stories about the family members that his parents had been too grief-stricken to talk about. His only way of connecting with his family is through the craft his father taught him, and that he in turn passed on to his son, repairing violins. And so Amnon continues to collect and restore instruments that were played by Jewish musicians before and during the Holocaust. Each violin tells its own story, and to Amnon, each violin